Raise some
Cain. You gotta raise some Cain. In the heartland where the faith runs strong, we've seen the shadows growing long. Watch those around us be deceived. Yeah, the fight is at our doors, no matter who we believe. Corruption, lawless, day and night. We'll speak the truth into the light. We'll bring the battle, heed the call. We'll watch the whole thing fall. We gotta raise some Cain, show the lies, break some chains and make things right. Feel the power, be the change. Time is now. We gotta raise some Cain.
Welcome, my fellow patriots, to another edition of the Raising Cain Show. Tonight, we've got a special guest, as we usually do, but this is going to be a little more personal because this is a man who has experienced the weaponization of our justice system. And that is something that, for those of you that have been following me for some time, know that I, too, have been through quite a bit in that realm. And so I'm very much interested in our guest tonight and what he has to say about the legal and political battles that he has had to fight. Dr. John Eastman is who I'm talking about. But before we get into our conversation, like I always do, I'm going to run our commercial breaks now. That way we can have an uninterrupted, no filter conversation to discuss all of these matters. So we'll be right back after a quick break. Thank you for joining us, and please stick with us.
It says, I woke up this morning and looked out the door to a country I don't recognize. They put masks on our face to hide our pain, and there's no fire in most people's eyes. And it's still true today. It's still true today that they've tried to destroy the American spirit. And in some instances, they've done a dadgum good job. But in other instances, they have lit an inferno in some people. And we right now are gathering some of those people that are on freaking fire to save this country.
Increasing expenses have caused us all a lot of pressure these days, and it's affecting even the wealthiest of people. Most have lost their sense of security, stability, and even hope for a strong financial future. The game plan of everyone in your cell phone has likely been disrupted or even hardcore stopped, and most are looking for a creative solution to regain financial momentum. Oftentimes, life's best solutions are the simplest. But first, a question. What is something most people think they should own but don't? Crypto, fine art, real estate? Nope. We are talking about real money. The kind kings and queens fought for and large institutions today buy in mass. We're talking about gold and silver, assets that provide confidence in tough financial situations. So the question is, do you own any? If you don't, you're not alone. Most people aren't maximizing the power of precious metals because it's just been too complicated. And even though they see advertisements about gold and silver daily, they don't really know who to trust. That is, until now. The bottom line is that buying gold and silver doesn't have to be complicated or scary. There's a simple, better way to accumulate assets and create financial peace, headache-free. And this very minute, a new community of average people are seeing above average results to the tune of tens of millions in assets over the last few years. This system is tested, it's simple, and it's not an experiment. To date, it's helped more than 80,000 people bring hope back into their lives. It's invitation only. And right now, this new community has accepted a challenge to give away as much free gold this year as possible. Curious? Learn how to get your free gold today. Check out the next step to get the details.
Since 2017, 150,000 farms have shut down. Working farmland has been reduced by 21 million acres. The system has been crippling the remaining farmers, forcing some to adopt nefarious farming techniques, like pumping hormones and other performance-enhancing drugs into their cows so they can survive in crammed feedlots. Or the farmers are forced to jump ship and sell to land-hoarding, profit-chasing agricultural oligarchies, who use their billions of dollars to crush the competition and increase your family's dependence on their manufactured food. What could possibly go wrong? The family farm will soon be a thing of the past, unless you do something. You can. That's why there's From the Farm, an industry-disrupting platform that connects consumers directly with local farmers, which means you can buy fresh, non-factory farm food, and you'll know exactly where your food came from and how it was raised. For the first time in nearly 100 years, independent farms will have a way to not only survive, but thrive. From the Farm was founded by A.J. Richards, an active homesteader, and Brooke Entz, a CrossFit Games athlete and an Amazonian warrior in the movies Wonder Woman and Justice League. She clearly has a passion for healthy food and a healthy lifestyle. And since both AJ and Brooke come from generations of ranchers and farmers, they know what they're talking about. We can't do this alone. We need the strength of the American people behind us. Help us build a new food system that combines the wisdom of the past with the technology of the future. Investing in From the Farm isn't just a financial decision. It's an investment into our future, our small family farms, and our food sovereignty. Invest today.
Welcome back, Patriots. Today, we welcome a man at the center of one of the most controversial legal and political battles in recent memory, Dr. John Eastman, a constitutional law scholar, former law clerk to Justice Clarence Thomas, and founding director of the Center for Constitutional Jurisprudence. Eastman is no stranger to public debate, but after the 2020 election, he found himself transformed from legal advisor to public enemy number one in the eyes of the left. Now, facing legal action himself, Eastman has emerged as a voice warning that the real danger isn't his legal theories. It's how the justice system is being weaponized against political dissent. He's here to help us understand what's at stake and why this fight goes far beyond one election. Dr. Eastman, thank you so much for joining us.
Nate, thanks for having me on. It's a very important topic, and I look forward to our discussion.
Absolutely. So, for those that may not have heard your story, can you give us kind of a quick rundown of kind of how things shifted for you? You went from, basically being on the offense to suddenly finding yourself on the defense.
Yeah, way back in 2000, I was hired by the Florida legislature to help them protect their electoral votes. One of the few experts in the country on the Electoral College and structural provisions of our Constitution. That was back in Bush versus Gore. For those in your audience who don't remember the importance of 2000. And I think in part because of that testimony and that expertise, President Trump called me in late November, asked me to represent him in a case that working on filing for the United States. That case ultimately was Texas versus Pennsylvania, Georgia, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And I filed a motion to intervene on behalf of President Trump in that lawsuit at the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court kicked the case out a couple days later, and we continued to look for ways to get the blatant illegality that occurred in the 2020 election before the courts or somebody to investigate. Did that illegality that opened the door for fraud, did people walk through that door and engage in fraud that affected the outcome of the election? And we looked at every possible avenue. Courts were refusing to hear the cases. We asked state legislatures to take it up because the whole presidential election system is delegated to the authority of the state legislatures. Article 2 of the Constitution makes that quite clear. And when their rules were not followed, we had a failed election. And that meant the power reverted back to the legislature to try and decide what to do about it. And then when rhinos combined with Democrats in the state legislatures were not doing anything about it, we looked at one other additional avenue, and that is the Constitution gives the power to the vice president in his role as president of the Senate to open and to count the votes. If you're going to open them, and there are multiple slates, obviously you have to make some judgment about which ones are the correct ones. Now, people say, well, I can't believe we would give all that authority to a single person, particularly somebody who's likely to be a candidate himself, as has happened a number of times in our history, including in 2020. And I tell people, well, the founders gave an immense amount of power to a single person called the president, the executive. The entire executive branch is derivative of a single person. They did that deliberately, because with that becomes accountability. You can't pass the buck to somebody else on a committee when you're the only one, when the buck stops with you, as Harry Truman famously said.
That's right.
And the other thing we know about the founders is they deliberately chose not to give Congress any role in the selection of the president, because that would destroy separation of powers. It would make the president subservient to the Congress, a parliamentary system. They'd spent the whole summer designing a system that was not that. And so they weren't going to undercut all of their work at that last moment with giving the Congress the power to choose the president. So I think there was a fairly compelling argument to be made that the vice president had some discretionary authority. And we weren't asking him to decide the election. We weren't asking him to declare Trump elected. We were asking him, Mike Pence, to accede to requests from hundreds of state legislators to say, we've got a lot of illegality that occurred in our election. The president pro tem of the Pennsylvania Senate was quite clear, our election should not have been certified given this illegality. Please give us a week or 10 days now that we're back in session to try and assess the impact of that illegality. And we'll report back to you pretty quickly. And if Biden actually won, taking account of that illegality, we'll let you know that. And the American people will have some solace in realizing that the election had been investigated and the results, despite the illegality, were properly certified. But if in fact Biden didn't win that election, a cornerstone of our system of government, right there in the Declaration of Independence, consent of the governed is what's required. And if you're putting into office a guy who didn't have the consent of the governed, we give that consent through free and fair elections. Then we're no longer in charge of our government. We're no longer the sovereign we the people, the first three words of the Constitution. And we increasingly become sheep of an increasingly tyrannical government. So those were the stakes, in my view, of what was wrong with that election. And everybody wanted to throw it under the rug. But because I refused to do so, I was unindicted co-conspirator number 2 in Jack Smith's criminal indictment against President Trump in Washington, D.C. I was indicted co-conspirator number 3 down in Fannie Willis's ridiculous criminal racketeering count against President Trump and me and Rudy Giuliani and some electors down there. And then a state that I had nothing to do with, I was indicted in Arizona as well. And the Georgia and the Arizona criminal matters are still pending. Fannie Willis down in Georgia has been disqualified, but she's still pursuing parts of the case, even though she's disqualified. It's really stunning. The Attorney General in Arizona was caught hiring a virulently anti-Trump NGO called States United Democracy Center to help her prepare the prosecution memo for us. And I said, that's like hiring the fox to do the safety memo for your chicken coop. It's just insane. Obviously it's biased. The prosecutors are supposed to be neutral. They're not supposed to come in with a political axe to grind. And yet when you're hiring an overtly anti-Trump private organization to design your criminal prosecution, you're breaching one of the most important requirements of ethical prosecutors. Now, by the way, that's the same group that filed the bar complaint against me in California, where I went through 10 weeks of trial. The law most expensive bar disciplinary proceeding in history, we think. And that matter is still pending. We took it up to the court, the bar court appellation, and they issued an even more ridiculous decision. And now we got to go to the California Supreme Court and then ultimately the U.S. Supreme Court. But on that matter alone, I've spent more than $1 million defending myself. They said I had no evidence of illegality and fraud. And I said, well, the courts weren't looking at it. So here's an opportunity to put all the evidence in the record. And we did extensively, despite the judge blocking a lot of our evidence and a lot of our witnesses. What remains is still the most comprehensive set of evidence and testimony under oath in any of the 65 or 100 cases that were involved election challenges. Most of the courts decisions were just dismissed because somebody lacked standing, or it was brought too early, or it was brought too late. That was one of my favorite ones. They brought it. There was a guidance from one of the secretaries of state, Wisconsin or Michigan, I can't remember which, that was clearly illegal. And the campaign brought a suit way before the election to challenge that illegal guidance, and the court dismissed it as not right, claiming it was just guidance. And until they actually follow the guidance on election day, there's no illegality. Well, then they filed, so they dismissed the case as not right, and then they followed the guidance on election day, committed those illegal acts, and the campaign brought the suit the next day. Said, see, we told you they violated the law. And they said, you can't wait till your guy loses to bring the case. You should have brought it months ago. I mean, this is it was such an abuse.
Court is what
such an abuse of the judicial system, with activist judges participating in this. One judge on the Michigan Supreme Court during the hearing there told the Trump lawyer, I'm not listening to anything you say because all you want to do is keep your king in power. This from the bench, and we only know that because one of the other judges on the court put the quotation in the dissenting opinion because it was so outrageous, and he wanted to memorialize it. But that's what we were dealing with.
So, Dr. Eastman, you mentioned something when you were talking about, when you first started talking about this, that caught my attention. And I have heard this over and over again said by the left and said by the media in particular about how, the courts had ruled all of these cases, as basically that they had ruled that every case was lost when it came to election integrity in the federal courts. Now, that is a lie, because I remember I was involved in several of these cases myself as an expert witness in cybersecurity for 27 years. I was asked by the White House to join a team in Washington, D.C., and we were investigating and reporting our findings back to Trump's lawyers and back to Peter Navarro. And what we saw was that 57 cases, I think it was probably more than that, but at the time that I was counting, it was 57 cases where courts wouldn't even allow an evidentiary hearing. And that is not the same as losing your case. When they won't even allow the evidence to be presented, that's not a case. It's basically, there was never a judgment made, in my opinion. Can you explain that, what their possible justification for that was?
Well, some of the cases were brought by people that did not have standing. It always surprises most Americans, as it does me, that ordinary citizens don't have standing to challenge egregious violations of the law. But the Supreme Court over the decades has developed a doctrine on standing that requires a personal, particularized injury. So if the injury that you have is that the law is not being enforced, but you don't have any particularized harm, you share the harm with everybody else, you don't have standing. I had this fight. This doctrine was largely developed by Justice Scalia. It's one of the few areas of the law that I disagreed with him on, because I think it was always the part of the courts to take small injuries that are suffered by a lot of people and allow that to be brought forward. But nevertheless, current Supreme Court controlling precedent is if you don't have a particularized injury, you don't have standing to just challenge mere violations of the law. You're kind of an outsider looking in and saying, I don't like what I'm seeing here. I'm going to bring a suit. But you don't have any damages, any particular damages yourself.
So
now in election law, the people that have always been recognized as having standing, and of course the candidates, because they do have a particularized injury. Right. I'm not just complaining about ordinary violations of the law. I'm complaining about something that affected my ability to win the election. That's a particularized injury. But the Third Circuit Court of Appeals out of Pennsylvania held that even the candidate didn't have standing to challenge unconstitutional conduct in the course of the election by state election officials. The case is called Bognet, and it's astounding. Even the candidate doesn't have standing. The court there said only the legislature has standing to challenge the violations of the legislative rules. And then, of course, a couple of years ago, 100 and some legislators brought suit to challenge President Biden's weaponization of the federal government for the 2024 election. And the court there held the legislators didn't have standing, only the candidate did.
Yeah, it's interesting how they keep moving the goalposts. And the other case that that I was involved in, that I was an expert witness on, was the case that was brought before the Supreme Court, that was brought by multiple states, particularly and I don't, to this day, I cannot understand how they could say that a state doesn't have standing when another state, is basically violating their own legislative rules. And, of course, this was the case against Pennsylvania. And I was completely shocked at the Supreme Court's ruling on that, in them saying that these various states had no standing, because the whole premise of a union was that they agreed to certain things to become a part of that union at the Constitutional Convention. And one of those things, there was a lot of debate that went back and forth into whether or not to have a singular president, or whether to have a multiple a multi-person executive. But they settled on a singular executive. They settled on certain things, and some of those things were it's clear that they intended that there would be no cheating in the elections. And yet there was cheating that went on the elections. There were violations of the law, even in the states' laws. So how they could say that the states had no standing, when in fact allowing illegal votes to be counted in one state dilutes the votes of other states. It dilutes their I don't understand.
Well, I have to confess that when I first got wind of state versus state election, I was the question I raised: what standing does Texas or Louisiana or Missouri have to challenge what goes on in Georgia or Pennsylvania? And there's an old case from the 1980s called Anderson versus Calabrese. John Anderson was running as a third-party candidate in the 1980 election between Carter and Reagan. And he was blocked from getting access to the Ohio ballot because he hadn't filed a year ahead of time, or I forget the precise details. And a lawsuit was brought against Ohio for keeping John Anderson off of the ballot. And one of the plaintiffs in that case was a voter in New Jersey who argued, he said, look, my ability to elect my candidate of choice is diminished because of this rule in Ohio. And the Supreme Court upheld that New Jersey voter's standing on the ground that the only national office we have is the president. That's and right. What happened in Ohio affected the ability of that individual voter in New Jersey to have his candidate of choice have a possibility of being elected. So I said, okay, Anderson settles this thing. Texas has standing on behalf of its voters to challenge Pennsylvania. You would have thought that the Supreme Court would have at least addressed and given that controlling precedent. And they just dismissed the case with a one-line denied for lack of standing without any explanation at all. And what it told me is they did not want to touch this case. There's a story that ran in the New York Times around that time. It was supposedly based on a leak that came out of the Supreme Court, which is very rare. It's the only institution in Washington, D.C. that almost never has a leak, although we saw the the leak on steroids and the early release of the Dobbs opinion overruling Roe versus Wade. But the New York Times story, allegedly based on a source inside the court.
Real quick, speaking of which, since you brought that up, did anybody ever get charged for that?
Not yet. But I understand that with the new sheriff in town, that's one of the lingering controversies that they're looking at.
Yeah.
Anyway, what happened, what the New York Times reported is that Justice Alito said we need to take these cases. This is just like Bush versus Gore. And Roberts reportedly yelled at him, saying it's not like Bush versus Gore. If we take these cases, they will burn down our cities. Now, there are two significant things there. One, the court was being coward. If this is true, if this story is true, and there's enough circumstantial evidence that lends the story some credibility, even though it was published in the New York Times. I'll say it that way. It means the justices were being coward away from doing their duty. And secondly, it means that what went on in the summer of 2020, the summer of thugs, the summer of terror, the summer of burning down cities, was actually designed to have an impact much bigger and broader than we thought it was about. This was designed to tell the courts, you better not do anything about the illegality that is about to occur in the 2020 election, or we'll tear the country apart.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute, because remember, you had somebody that showed up at a protest out in front of the justices' houses. And I think it was Kavanaugh that somebody showed up with a gun with the intention of killing him. So clearly you had intimidation going on against these judges. And I find it despicable that these people who were out there in front of their homes, making threats, weren't arrested and put away for that. And, I'm all for the ability and the right to protest, but in front of somebody's home, that's kind of where I draw the line.
Well, and particularly with a gun, and particularly what was most dangerous about that leak of the Dobbs decision was, until the decision gets formally released, you're now putting a target on those judges. You take out one of those 5 justices in the majority, and you alter the opinion, because if the justice is killed, his vote doesn't count until the decision is released.
Yeah.
And so that leak was an open invitation to assassination. And then you get Senator Chuck Schumer, basically threatening the justices if they proceed with issuing a ruling on that issue. If the shoe were on the other foot, I mean, we criticize bad decisions from the court all the time, but we do it on the intellectual dearth of intellectual reasoning in the opinions. We don't do it by threatening them. And yet these threats have been going on, and they've been getting away with it. Now, I understand from news accounts that Pam Bondi and Kash Patel and Dan Bongino and others are actually picking up the thread of these investigations that were deliberately kept under the rug or shuffled under the rug. Look, why 5 years later do we still not know who planted the pipe bombs outside the DNC and the RNC?
Exactly.
This was a backup plan if the main plan didn't work.
Yeah.
Tell me we don't have geofencing data and facial recognition on whoever did. Tell me why 5.5 years later we still don't know who erected the gallows on the Capitol grounds at 6 a.m. the morning of January 6th. We've got the geofencing data. We've got the facial recognition. We can track people's cell phones. Why don't we know that? Because that's the Pulitzer Prize winning photo. Right. And why don't we know who was the embedded guy that yelled "Hang Mike Pence" to give the narrative to go along with the gallows? Why don't we know those things this much longer?
Well, yeah, I think it's clear we know the answer to that. I mean, this whole thing was a setup from the get-go. And I think we're going to find out more about that. I think that is I think partly what's going to get revealed, especially as we're beginning to see, the Office of Director of National Intelligence beginning to release and declassify some of these secret meetings that were going on, where they intentionally, they put in a I don't know how else to call it, a soft coup against Trump to try to stop him from being able to do his duties as the president, the duly elected president of the United States in
And it
2016.
goes back before that, before he was elected. Hillary Clinton laundered is the word I use, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars through her law firm, Perkins Coie,
Yep.
to hire Fusion GPS, who was relying on a former foreign intelligence officer with a Russian asset source to create a false dossier, right? And then they reported those funds as campaign finance compliance. That's an overt violation and trying to hide a criminal activity. That dossier was then used with full knowledge that it was fake, was used by government officials at the highest levels to obtain spy warrants, FISA court warrants on the president's campaign, the opposing political candidate's campaign. And they continued to spy on him after he was elected, and they continued to spy on him after he was inaugurated. This is the biggest political scandal in our nation's history. And to date, there's only been one person that held to account at all with a minor slap on the wrist. Kevin Kleinsmith pled guilty to falsifying one of the records that was submitted to the FISA court, and he got a light misdemeanor sentence, and he got a 1-year suspension of his bar license, retroactive, so that the bar license suspension was already over before the order of suspension was even handed down. You talk about double standards versus what I've been going through with the California bar, with just lie after lie after lie being hurled at me. Eastman knew that there was no evidence of illegality and fraud because Bill Barr said so. It's like, I'm sorry, I don't take things that government says without receipts with just at face value, because they lie. And Bill Barr was found to have lied. People tried to follow up on what investigations he did. It turns out he did nothing. Not only did he do nothing, but he ordered other people that wanted to do stuff to stand down.
Well, I'll tell you even more than that. So I was actually involved with the Amistad Project, helping them with some of their cases. And in particular, the case that involved Jesse, the truck driver, that had ballots that were loaded onto the back of his truck. I'm sure you're familiar with with that story. Well, in that case, I brought in a couple of investigators that I knew that were really good at what they do. And they were able to track down the lady who actually loaded those ballots onto the back of the truck. They got a witness statement from her in her own writing. I've seen it with my own eyes. I was there during the conference call when Bill Barr and you had John Durham Jr. and you had the U.S. Postmaster General for New York that were all brought in to create a special task force. And 3 days later, Bill Barr shuts the whole thing down and then goes on the AP and says, I've seen no evidence of widespread voter fraud, which was a complete lie. I mean, we're talking massive counterfeit operations that were going on that merited further investigation. In fact, the company involved that we suspect that was involved in that was a subsidiary of another company who had a subsidiary print shop in Michigan, suspected of doing the same thing. This was a massive conspiracy. This was not a one-off, ballot stuffing. No, it was a major operation, and they distributed ballots all over the states that were swing states. There's no doubt in my mind.
No, to this day, there are more ballots that were counted in Pennsylvania than there are voters reported as having cast ballots. 121,000 more ballots than voters. And in my Barr trial, the deputy secretary of state of Pennsylvania said, well, that's just, you guys are wrong, because the voter rolls are constantly changing. So people that get dropped off the voter rolls, having moved, that they wouldn't have, and the numbers would reconcile.
That's why.
Well, we actually looked at that. 16,000 people that dropped off the voter rolls. That still leaves 105,000 more ballots than voters, and the margin in Pennsylvania was 80,000.
I worked with Judge Gableman and in some of the investigations that he did in Wisconsin, and one of the things that we discovered that was very interesting was you had a whole bunch of voter rolls that got purged like within a day or two after the election. And those names that got purged, they all had something in common. They had the same phone number listed. Same phone number. Now, I thought maybe this is some sort of like software edit error. Like, if somebody didn't put a phone number in, that it just automatically populated. We double checked that. That wasn't the case. We think it was used as a means of being able to, because you have to have some sort of key in order to identify those fake voters that you put in there in order to know which ones to remove. And we think that's what was going on.
And there's another, I don't remember the details of this, but there's something very odd in the Wisconsin voter rolls. You go in and you register to vote. It goes into a statewide system, and you get a voter ID number that's sequential from the prior one. So if you're, the million and first person to register, your voter ID is 1,000,001. And then the next person comes in and their voter ID is 1,000,002. There are large gaps of voter ID numbers in the Wisconsin voter rolls, which makes it possible using sophisticated data analysis to identify voters without having a separate checkbox or column for identifying them. There's something else that was very fishy that a guy named Jay Valentine discovered in Maricopa County, Arizona, because he was downloading. He's got a very sophisticated computer system he calls it fractal technology that is able to analyze billions of data points in a fraction of the time that normally takes. And he had voter rolls from before and during and after the election. And he noticed that thousands and thousands of mail-out ballots were sent to people whose last digit of their zip codes was changed right before the mailing occurred. Now, what does that do? That means it's undeliverable mail because it's got the wrong zip code. That shows up in an undeliverable mail bin in the post office, and those ballots disappear. And people are paying $10 a ballot for this stuff, for gauge of fraud. Yeah. And so when questioned about it, the officials in Maricopa County said, well, the post office consolidates zip codes all the time, and we have to update. And Jay Valentine's response was, well, then why the day after the election did the digits get changed back again? Did they unconsolidate? I mean, every time you catch them red-handed, they come up with some fake story, and they think we're idiots that will just accept it.
Yeah. Well, ballot stuffing has always been. Yeah, ballot stuffing's always been kind of the most likely cause of cheating in most elections. And what they did effectively by creating these drop boxes and allowing massive mail-in ballots was they created that same system of cheating, but they exponentially allowed it, on steroids. And I think that.
Yeah, go ahead. No, I'll give you another example.
Sure.
In Colorado, the law is very clear. If you're only residing in Colorado temporarily while you're attending one of that state's universities, you are not allowed to vote, right? But Boulder County allows you to show up with your student ID in order to register to vote without any proof that you're anything other than a student from out of state who's not eligible to vote under Colorado law.
So I have had a long-standing theory, and this actually I kind of developed when I was working in Wisconsin. We were looking at some anomalies in the voter registration, and we were noticing that there were like 25,000 names all registered around the same time that all had the same address. And I'm like, what address is this? And it was the University of Wisconsin. And so it got me thinking. So I called Pennsylvania and just did a little bit of, private sleuthing myself and pretended to be, somebody interested in getting a job at the mailroom, acting like I was a student. And so I was just asking some questions. And I got somebody to share with me that the students handle the mail. Now, technically, when mail is being delivered to somebody's post office, normally you've got a federal agent, the postman, who is the person who handles that mail until it gets to their mailbox. But at a university, it goes to the central mail sorting facility, and this was the case in Pennsylvania. It goes to this, to the central postage exchange on the campus, the mailroom, and students are handling these mails. That means they're handling the absentee ballots, and they're all of that is being handled by students. Now, if you wanted to intercept absentee ballots, fill them out, send them back in, that would be a pretty easy way to do it without anybody knowing the difference. And here's the thing. What we don't know is, let's say that the state law says that you can register to vote if you're, temporarily going to school there. And obviously that wasn't the case in Colorado. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that a state said that's okay. Clearly, what's not okay is that when you're no longer a student there and you don't live there anymore, you should not be registered to vote in that state. But yet we see no evidence whatsoever. And I brought this up to my own officials here in West Virginia, for example, because I saw, interestingly enough, anomalies in only 2 counties. Now, one of those counties, I know what the issue was. In Mingo County, you had, and this was reported to the FBI by our Secretary of State at the time, Mac Warner, who referred it to the FBI because there were Democrats who were coming into Mingo County from the other across state line, and they were paying people in the poorest county of our state to vote Democrat. Now, that's clearly illegal. But the other thing that was going on, where I saw massive anomalies and there was no explanation for it, you had no major shift of population, you had no major shift of registrations, towards Democrats from Republican, and yet there were about 3,000 additional, there was about a 3,000 vote flip in that county, and that was the county of Monongalia, which is where West Virginia State University is. And so I've been suspecting for some time that through our universities has been one of the big areas where a lot of this bulk mass cheating has been going on, because it's an easy place to get away with it, where there's not a lot of view. And let's face it, a lot of these university professors and administrators are very, very left wing. And in fact, I would even go so far as to say communist in some states.
Yeah. Well, and the other easy place for voter fraud was in Wisconsin. You mentioned Justice Gableman a little bit ago, that you worked with him. What a great man.
Yeah.
Who's also been run through the ringer. People should, do a Google search. I don't know his website off the top of my head, but find his legal defense fund site and send him some money, because, or Jim Troupas up there as well. But what Mike Gableman discovered in his investigation, hired by the state legislature to conduct this, is that there was an illegality. The Secretary of State ordered that the mandatory bipartisan teams going into nursing homes, that they couldn't go into nursing homes.
Yes.
Under the pretext of COVID. It's too dangerous. Now, mind you, the fish tank cleaners still got to go into the nursing homes. So apparently, cleaning the sides of the fish tank is more important than the exercise of our voting rights. But the Secretary of State prohibited them from going in. And then what Mike Gableman discovered is that turnout rates in the nursing homes went from a historic average of 20 to 25% to nearly 100%, including in memory care wings, and thousands of the ballots are in the same handwriting. So that illegality opened the door for a fraud, and people walk through that door. Yeah. And the sheriff in Racine County is trying to prosecute it, and he's getting roadblocks thrown up everywhere he turns for that.
Yeah, and for folks of you that don't understand what he's talking about in the memory care wing, we're talking about people that have Alzheimer's, that there's no reason whatsoever that they would be fit for voting in an election. It's the same thing when you have somebody that is mentally impaired, to the point where they can't. Obviously, if they don't know who their own relatives are, they're not fit to be voting in an election. That is actually a standard that you're supposed to meet. And this is why we have had elections in person, so that election judges can actually verify that these people, number one, are fit to vote, that they are people who actually have the right to vote in that area as well. It's shameful what has gone on in this country.
Something else that went on in Wisconsin. Wisconsin's very strict on absentee voting. Voting is a fundamental right, but absentee voting by absentee or by mail, is a privilege. That's the language in the Wisconsin election code. And in order to vote, you have to provide your ID unless you're indefinitely confined. And county clerks in a couple of the largest Democrat counties said, if you're afraid of COVID, you're indefinitely confined, so you don't have to give us your ID. That was held to be illegal. They did it anyway. And then you have to have a witness. A witness signs under oath, their name and their address and their phone number, signs under oath that the person that's putting the ballot in the envelope is who they say they are, right?
Yeah.
And thousands of those ballots came in with the witnesses that hadn't filled in their address. And the county clerks were handwriting in the addresses on the envelope. In other words, they were doctoring the evidence of the election ballots in order to make an illegal or a disqualified ballot legal. Or appear to be illegal, and we know that happened. And people tell me that we had no evidence. I mean, we had evidence more than we could possibly manage. And yet, because I said there's illegality, one of the things they charged me with is, Eastman said there was massive evidence of illegality. But because he asked other lawyers on the team for some specifics, that means he knew there wasn't any evidence. I mean, and I'm going to be, I'm recommended for disbarment because I shined a light on this illegality.
So let me ask you about that, because that's where I get really interested in your case in particular. Look, there's a lot of lawyers that were involved in. Granted, it seems like many of the lawyers in particular came under attack through, either through lawsuits that were frivolous lawsuits or ridiculous lawsuits, or through disbarment proceedings and things like that. Do you think that you lawyers in particular were an easy target because they had a way of getting at your profession through disbarment? Because this is the same thing they did to doctors who wanted to prescribe ivermectin, who were cautious about not wanting people to take vaccines. They went after their license to do their job. They went after, the AMA and all of that. It seems to me that seems to be a means of manipulation and control by going after these people's, to their livelihoods.
Well, look, and we've known this for a long time. I mean, it's across the professions, and it's in the universities as well. The accreditation agencies are taken over by hard left advocates, and then they impose requirements on accreditation that if you don't bend the knee to, you can have your accreditation revoked. Dr. Simone Gold, who I got to know during this process, she had her medical. I mean, she's unbelievably. She's both a lawyer and a medical doctor. She knows her stuff, and she was challenging the COVID protocols. They yanked her license. Now, happily, I saw a news account just last week that the revocation of her license was overturned by an appellate court. Thank God.
Thank God.
But these professional licensing agencies, these disciplinary panels, the medical boards in her profession, the bar associations in the legal profession that have been going after me, and hundreds of other lawyers. But for some reason, they've decided to make me the poster child on all this stuff. I think it's because I won't stop talking about the illegality. And I come as a former Supreme Court clerk myself and a former dean of a law school. I come with a measure of credibility that maybe the ordinary lawyer doesn't have. And that's why they have to take me down on me. Not just to discredit everything I've been exposing, but to send a message to everybody else that says, if we can take Eastman down, imagine what we can do to you. And therefore to cower people into silence, to never take on cases or clients that go counter to the status quo. I think President Trump, at the beginning of his administration here, when he went after Perkins Coie and a couple of the other law firms, I think that was a brilliant move, because he's got all of the bar groups, including mine out in California, complaining about how outrageous it is that they're going after lawyers. Well, sitting there with a straight face, well, they do exactly the same thing to me and have been for 4 years. So he's got them now all on record saying you can't do this. Now, let's be fair. They don't think consistency is something that they have to be troubled by. If they didn't have double standards, they wouldn't have any standards at all, is the old line.
Yeah. Yep, that's very true. It's a shame. Now, do you see with a new administration, obviously that doesn't necessarily change these, these lifetime judges that are corrupt. But do you see any changes that are happening that are at least creating some light at the end of the tunnel? And if not, or if so, even where do we go from here? Because I've never seen our justice system in such disarray. And so, you know, when I think of America, one of the founding principles in American politics is that, you know, equal justice under the law. And I don't see that. In fact, I haven't seen that for a very long time, going all the way back to when I blew the whistle, which is why I blew the whistle, because it wasn't equal justice under the law. They were giving Hillary Clinton a pass because of her political position that they would never have given to anybody else. And a perfect example of that is look at what they did with her on the email server. You had Comey himself say in front of the public, she had thousands of classified emails, including 7 email chains with top secret special access programs on a private email server. And then he has the audacity to say, oh, and they had evidence that foreign adversaries had accessed that server. So there was actual damage done to the United States. But he has the audacity to say after that, but no reasonable prosecutor would bring a case against her for this. This kind of stuff's been going on.
While all that was going on, there was a sailor on a submarine that took a picture of himself with a submarine in the background. He took a picture of his hot rack, basically a sleeping mattress, a cot. There's nothing classified in that photo, but he violated the rules by taking the photo in the submarine and posting it online, and they threw his butt in prison. Yep. Absolutely. Yep. That I always bring that up. And look, let's be real clear. Why did Hillary Clinton have a private server? In my view, and I think this has been well documented in the book by Peter Schweitzer, she and her husband were running one of the largest pay-to-play scams,
that's right,
I think, in our history. For God's sakes, they sold 90% of our uranium reserve to the Russians. And they were getting massive donations from foreign governments all over the world to the Clinton Foundation.
All of those documents.
And all of that was being run. She didn't want to run that out of the State Department. She wanted to run it out of a private server. And then she destroyed the documents while they were under subpoena from a House committee.
Nobody would get away with that other than her.
Yeah. No, and look, I mean, Pam Bondi, Cash Patel, Dan Bongino, Ed Martin, looking at the weaponization, and I hope they're not just looking at the Russia collusion story with Hillary, but they're looking at the server. But more broadly, you know, and this is very important. You kind of put the data points together, because I'm not on the inside. I don't know. They're drinking from a fire hose. There is so much corruption there.
You brought up something that was very important, and that is the illegal spying that was going on using FISA Section 702. You had a federal judge that said 258,000 illegal uses of Section 702, which is unwarranted searches of people's digital data, never supposed to happen on the United States soil ever. I know, because I was read onto that program, and they were using it like it was a game, and they were unmasking people, American citizens. You know, when you unmask something and it's an American, you're supposed to delete that entry because it was never collected under the Constitution. But yet they were using this. Yet I've not heard a single FBI agent who violated this go to jail for that. That's deprivation of rights under color of law.
Well, it is. And, you know, unfortunately, the rank and file are just following orders. The people that need to be held accountable are at the top of this chain.
Absolutely.
Many of them got pardons by Joe Biden's auto pen on their way out the door.
Yeah,
and I think we've not seen the end of that story yet. If the president is not making the decision to issue a pardon, somebody else is impersonating the president of the United States. We got a pretty small group of people that had access to that auto pen that would qualify. That's a federal felony, a very serious felony.
I think there was recent testimony, actually. Somebody finally admitted, you know, that there was some wrongdoing there. And so I can't remember the article, but I just saw it yesterday, and I hadn't had a chance to read through it all, but I'm gonna have to pull that back up and take a look at that.
You've got a lot of people, and you know they're pardoned, so they think they're clean. But if the pardons are invalid because they were not signed by the person that had authority to sign them, And the other thing that's interesting about the pardons is Biden pardoned everybody on the J6 committee and all the staffers.
Yeah, why was that? What
Well,
did
if they didn't do anything
what did they
wrong.
possibly do wrong that they would need a
Yeah.
pardon, right?
But what's really interesting about that is
Crazy.
the real puppet master behind that, as far as I've been able to tell, was somebody by the name of Mary McCord. And she was too important or self-important to be a mere member of the staff. So she just insisted on being hired on as a high-paid consultant to the committee. The pardon only covered staff. It doesn't cover consultants. So she's not under pardon. And what's really interesting is that everybody that is under those pardons no longer has a Fifth Amendment defense to answering questions under subpoena. So I would bring Liz Cheney before a grand jury or before a committee of Congress and say, answer our questions. If you refuse, we're going to refer you for criminal contempt of Congress, and you should get the same treatment that Peter Navarro and Steve Bannon did for refusing.
Yep. Put 'em in shackles.
And if you lie to us, then we'll get you for false testimony under oath. And that's not covered by a pardon because it hadn't occurred by the time the pardon issued. And that's
right.
Even assuming the pardons are valid in the first place. But here we are 6 months after those pardons were issued, and none of those people have been hauled before a grand jury, as far as I know, or before any committee of Congress. And it's time to expose this stuff, because the only way we're going to put a stop to it is that the people that engaged in this most egregious outrage of our nation's history, the biggest political scandal of our nation's history, if they are not held accountable for it, then God help us, they'll just do it again next time it's a chance.
100% agree. And until the other thing that to me is just as important as ensuring that they don't do this again and putting that fear of God in them is the fact that you have an American people right now that have an extreme distrust of the FBI, of the Department of Justice, of our entire judicial system. And I think the only way to restore the people's trust in those institutions again is to ensure that the people who committed crimes under the auspices of their position go to jail. That is the only way that you're going to have trust again in the system, is that when they see a true airing and accounting of what happened and there's justice done.
From your lips to Pam Bondi's ears.
Yeah, absolutely. I sure hope so, because I'll tell you, I'm trying really, really hard not to be cynical after 8 years basically of seeing this kind of nonsense going on and on and on with nobody that, like, all the people that I basically risked my life to blow the whistle. The things that you were talking about, the money laundering, all that with Hillary Clinton, those are the documents I carried out. It was all the evidence the FBI had, and it was all very credible evidence, credible enough for a Democrat-appointed IG, DOJ IG Horowitz, to deem it credible and give it a rating of a national security threat of urgent concern, and giving me the right to take it to both intel committees and telling me that I could hold on to the thumb drive just in case those committees did nothing. I could take it to the Senate Judiciary. And of course, the FBI raided me, took possession of that thumb drive.
What's the story that broke about the Mar-a-Lago raid the other day? What they were trying to do is recoup the illegal documents that they had created at that December 9th meeting in the Oval Office.
And it was
it had nothing to do with national security or classified documents. It was all a scam. Look,
it's kind of funny because, I always jokingly say that I got Mar-a-Lago. I say there's two different ways, right? You either get Roger Stoned, where they kick in your door in the middle of the night and they have already notified CNN so that they're there in the bushes, right? Or they don't want it being, very public. And so they Mar-a-Lago, they go knock nicely on the door and, it's just a friendly visit. We just want to come in and talk. And then once you're there, then they serve you the search warrant. And then they can detain you and they can go do whatever they want to do.
At least they showed you the search warrant. When they took my phone, they refused to show me the search warrant. And to this day, the search warrant authorized them to seize
they showed me part of
electronic equipment that's mentioned in the attached affidavit, and they never yet have given me the attached affidavit.
Yeah,
and I'm pretty sure the phone they seized wasn't on there because I had just bought it.
That's a standard. So it's interesting you mentioned that. So they did the same thing to me. When they served me the search warrant, now granted, I'm not a lawyer. I had never, ever been served a search warrant, so I had no idea what to look for. but they gave me a copy of the front page of the search warrant, and but they did not give me the Schedule B. So they had the Schedule A, which showed where they were allowed to search, but they did not give me the Schedule B, which says what they were allowed to take. And they took things that were not on the Schedule B because my lawyer had to threaten them to get them to release the Schedule B to her. And when we went over it, they had taken, for example, some of my wife's journal entries, like they actually tore pages out of her private diaries. That was not on the list.
Right.
It was crazy what they took.
Well, in Arizona, the search warrants that were served for my email accounts, because when my secretary at the law school was on her deathbed, she asked me to become the executor of her estate, and I took over her private email account just to deal with things. They searched her email account. They did the same thing with my brother-in-law's email account when I became his executor, or my wife did. I guarantee you they had no probable cause for either of those.
They searched,
but with the search warrant on my phone, there was something even more dangerous. The Fourth Amendment requires, in order to search and seize, that they identify the things with particularity.
That's right.
Right. And you can't just say, I want all the data on the phone. That's a general warrant. I want all the data you've ever produced ever. That's a warrant. The Fourth Amendment was written specifically to prohibit general warrants. And the way they got around that was they said, we're only seizing the data. We won't search the data without a subsequent warrant that gives the particularity. Well, 2 months later, I start getting inquiries from a taint team in Portland, Oregon, asking, are you going to assert attorney-client privilege over the following documents? I said, where are you getting those documents? And they said, well, we've got them from your phone. I said, there's been no subsequent warrant with particularity. And they said, oh, yes, there has. I said, I wasn't given it. Well, of course you weren't, because by then the phone was in our possession. So we served the warrant on ourselves.
Oh, well, that's the same crap they pulled with me. In fact, I found out that I had, number one, look, I was read on to a lot of the surveillance tools and stuff like that. So I know when I'm being spied on. I can very easily see when I have a process that's been taken over on my phone. I caught them. I caught them using FISA-related tools on me. I caught them. I found out from somebody who I won't name his name or name even how I know him, but somebody reached out to me and said that they were reached out to by somebody they know in intelligence that told them that they were being looked at very intrusively because of their association with me. Now, that right there is a 2-hop rule. That's FISA all the way. How in the world they got away with that, I don't know. But it's interesting that the federal judge, or I should say it was the Maryland magistrate that signed off on the search warrant of my home, a FOIA request was sent to that magistrate to ask a singular question. They got, I think it was the Daily Wire News Foundation. They got their, lawyers together and they said, okay, what's the question that we can ask that there's no way they could deny it? They can't say, oh, this could impede an investigation or anything like that. So they asked a simple 1-sentence question. Was the U.S. magistrate noticed, or the Maryland magistrate notified that I was a protected whistleblower under the Intelligence Community Whistleblower Protection Act? And a Clinton-appointed federal judge put a seal on that answer, and then she sealed her justification for putting a seal on that answer. How in the world do we live in a constitutional republic when that kind of crap can go on?
Well, here's how we do it. And Winston Churchill famously said once, if you're going through hell, don't stop, keep going. And I think the silver lining in what happened in 2020 and all the lawfare that happened in the 4 years of the Biden administration, and in many instances continues to happen at these local DA or state AG level, has awakened the American people to this corruption of our government, this abuse of power, in a way that had President Trump actually been inaugurated back in 2021, we would have never seen. I think the American people are awakened to it now. That's why President Trump won so overwhelmingly in 2024. It's why the American people continue to support him in record numbers because they're shining a light on this stuff. I mean, you look at the corruption of USAID and the tax money flowing.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, you know, and
Yeah.
the old narrative is, oh, they're cutting our funding. We're going to have all these poor kids in Africa. It's just not working because people have seen how corrupt it was. And so
Yeah.
I think shining the light is the best disinfectant working, and the American people are paying attention. And when the American people, we get lackadaisical. Let's face it. I mean, we'd much rather go to the Yankees Sox game, or you know, go to the soccer field with our kids or grandkids than pay attention to this crap. But what happened over the last 5 years, has brought it right directly in front of everybody. And you no longer have an option of pretending it's not going on. You have to stand up and exercise your rights as a sovereign people if you're going to continue to deserve the name of sovereign people. And I think the American people are standing to the rising to the challenge.
Yeah, I think you're right. I do feel hopeful that the truth is going to be exposed and it is going to come out. I just, no doubt in my mind. What I am not sure is where we go from there. Are they going to bring prosecutions? Will there be sufficient indictments and things like that? Or are they just going to let things, you know, get swept under the rug and let's move on from this and try to, you know, correct it? And to be honest with you, you know, there's like some of it, I know there are statute of limitations on some of this stuff. And that's one of the things that concerns me.
Well, there is, but you know, statute of limitations have a couple of exemptions or exceptions.
Sure.
One of them is if you have deliberately tried to hide your misconduct, and then the statute of limitations is told until the misconduct is discovered. And of course, what we saw with creating a room of all these documents that were not even listed on logs in response to subpoenas. That's deliberate attempt to hide the crime, and that tolls the statute of limitations. The other thing that's important, and I think DNI Tulsi Gabbard chose her words very carefully when she called it a treasonous conspiracy. Mm-hmm. Conspiracy means you can have lots of overt acts that fall outside of the statute of limitations. There are overt acts that are within the statute of limitations. You can still prosecute people for the overall conspiracy. And her choice of that word is extremely important. It does two things. One, it gets around the normal statute of limitations problem because many of these acts occurred within the last 5 years during the Biden administration. But it also means it's a nationwide conspiracy. And that means that I don't have to bring it in the district, the corrupt District of Columbia courts and jury pool. I can bring it where any of the overt acts occurred, such as maybe down in Mar-a-Lago in the Southern District of Florida for the illegal rape.
That would be very interesting.
You know, all of these things are now open to the prosecutorial team, which is headed, you know, at the top by Pam Bondi. But of course, Ed Martin, head of the weaponization task force, I think the Democrats are going to rue the day they blocked his nomination as a D.C. U.S. Attorney for D.C. and all he did was get elevated now with a nationwide portfolio.
That would be some poetic justice. Oh, man. Now, you know, I got to ask, so your thoughts on Tulsi Gabbard's use of the word treasonous. Now, granted, she didn't say treason, which treason but she did say treasonous. And that leaves me to wonder, is there more here that involves collusion with a foreign adversary than just, you know, people trying to vie for power within the United States?
Oh, and it's very important here. And I know my friends and supporters and followers on Twitter, X, Facebook, all those things want treason charges brought, partly because it's a capital offense.
Yeah.
But the treason's the only crime specifically defined in the Constitution, and it requires giving aid and comfort to the enemy. And enemy is not a colloquial word there. We talk about Russia as our enemy or China as our enemy, economic enemies, cultural enemies. The meaning of the word in the Constitution is very specific. Are we at war with them? And if we're not, They're not our enemy in the constitutional sense. So they may have been doing this in collaboration with China or Russia or Iran or whoever, but we're not at war with them, and I don't think they qualify as enemies in that sense. So there's not,
That's
treason is
my
not on the
assessment
table.
as well. Yeah,
Seditious conspiracy,
that I agree with.
conspiracy charge broader, whatever. I think is, and if you look at her statement, she did say treasonous conspiracy, but
Yeah,
conspiracy is the legal art. The treasonous is the political word in that
right.
statement. And
Exactly.
in our common parlance, they did act treasonously. They tried to take out the elected president of the United States.
Yep.
And in the way we normally talk about those things, that's what that is. So that's the political narrative. The legal narrative is the word conspiracy.
Conspiracy, right. Yeah, I agree with you on that. I think that's an important distinction to make. And, I would rather look at things from the very strictest legal terminology that they're using, because otherwise, you're just selling opium. And and I do think that there is evidence, I think, of seditious conspiracy. Interestingly enough, I never really even knew that term until those charges were brought against January 6ers, which the Supreme Court said no, that doesn't qualify. But what's interesting is I think there is some seditious conspiracy that does qualify with what we are seeing being unearthed by ODNI.
Well, even the Section 1512C charges that the Supreme Court threw out in the Fisher J6 case, because that was, I mean, by the way, people don't understand. 1512 is the old mob witness intimidation statute.
Right.
If somebody was turning state's evidence against the mob, and you threatened him with his life or the life of his family, that got an extra 20 years tacked on to whatever you were going to get otherwise. They amended that statute to include destruction of documents to avoid prosecution after the Enron scandal. And then and it says, destroy the documents or otherwise try and obstruct a judicial proceeding. Well, they tried to say otherwise meant anything you're doing obstructing it qualifies. Supreme Court said no. But what we learned from Tulsi Gabbard 2 weeks ago now is that this one did involve alteration of documents, phoning up of documents, phoning up of the president's daily briefing in order to create a false Russia collusion narrative that they all knew to be false. That does involve documents, and they were hiding them and altering them. That means that 1512C is available to prosecute those people. And I guarantee you, I mean, Tulsi Gabbard didn't make a public referral of criminal charges to the Department of Justice on a whim. They've crossed the T's and dotted the I's, and I expect before much longer we're going to see some perp walks.
We've got to. It's interesting. So I've got a little bit of inside knowledge on at least some of the stuff that she brought out. For example, one of the documents. So I'm known mostly for the uranium one stuff, but that was really just maybe 1/10 of the documents that I carried out. Most of it was a lot of evidence related documents, particularly to money trail and suspicious activity reports, TSARs, that sort of thing. But there were a couple of other documents that had nothing to do with any of that I brought out because I was concerned. One of them was an intelligence assessment on the 2016 election and whether or not Russia had hacked our election. And the assessment that had been done by our intelligence was that no, they had not hacked our election. That if anything, there might have been some support for bots to try to sway people one way or the other on social media. But in their own assessment, they showed that it was pretty evenly distributed. If anything, it leaned a little bit more towards Hillary Clinton. And I brought that document out because Comey lied on the stand before Congress when he basically went before them and said under oath that the evidence showed that the Russians had tried to. So now what I didn't know is I didn't know that there was a secret meeting and falsification of documents and all of that stuff that was going on, within the within the NSC. But I did have that assessment and I carried that out, and that was one of the documents that got handed over to the IG and went to both the House and the Senate Intel committees.
Yeah, no, and I mean, the cards are falling into place and the dominoes are starting to fall.
Yeah.
And at the end of that day, if the people that did this aren't held accountable, your cynicism will be multiplied by a factor of 10.
Yes, absolutely.
So, Nate, this has been a real pleasure,
Likewise.
and we need to stay in touch because you've got some additional information about the Pennsylvania truck beyond what I have, and I'd like to follow up and get that. I of course read his deposition testimony or his declaration.
Yeah.
I read all the debunking.
I interviewed him and spoke with him and worked with a couple of fellows that I won't name their names publicly, but privately I'll talk to you and I'll get you in touch with them because there's some things that are going on there. But yeah, I would love to talk with you more, offline. And, we've been going at this for about an hour, so, hour and 15 minutes. But John, what's the best thing that people can do right now? Obviously your Give, Send, Goes there. What's going on with your case and how can people help?
So we've had a couple of victories in Arizona and Georgia in the criminal matters, but it's still pending in the courts of appeal, and they're desperately trying to reverse those judgments for us and continue the prosecution. The California Bar, we're going to the California Supreme Court. Our opening brief is due in a couple of weeks. And these things are expensive to keep fighting. I've spent 1.6, nearly 1.7 million so far. The givesendgo.com/Eastman site is where we do our legal defense fund. People can send donations. Please do so we can stay in the fight. But people can also send prayers. And then I also use that as a bit of a blog to keep people apprised of what's going on. If you want to bring tears to your eyes, dig back into update number 43 and look at the article my kids wrote in defense of their dad a year ago, update 43 at givesendgo.com/Eastman. This stuff is important, and it's not just me. I mean, they take my bar license. I'm at retirement age. So what? But they are trying to scare lawyers from ever taking on any case for anybody that dares stand up to corruption in our government. And we cannot operate as a self-governing republic if that is allowed to stand. And so, that's why I'm fighting. Is one of my former students gave a toast to me at one point, and he said, if you think about the last line in our national anthem, the question is always, is the flag still waving? But it's really not so much whether the flag still waves, but what kind of land it's waving over. Absolutely. Is it still the land of the free and the home of the brave? Or is it now the land of the coward and the home of the slave? And look, I've got grandkids now, and I'm not willing to hand off the baton to have them deal with what we've been dealing with the last decade. We need to put this genie back in the bottle, and we need to do it now because this is the greatest thing on God's green earth, as one of the Salem Network guys used to say. And it's important. Look, this is the fight for our time. It's comparable to the fight that our grandparents waged to keep freedom in the world in World War I or World War II. And it's starting to look a lot like the fight our founders waged and pledged their lives and their fortunes and their sacred honors to ensure that we'd have a system of freedom and flourishing on this continent. Now's our time to stand up, and everybody needs to do it. You can't. This is not something you get to sit on the sidelines and watch. It's not a football game where you just you go get your hot dog and beer. This is contact sport for every American, and everybody needs to stand up to it.
There's a saying that everybody's heard, if you see something, say something. And I have to say that, there are many times I look back in my life and I go, what the heck was this? The whole point of all of this whistleblowing stuff. It's brought nothing but trouble in my life. It is hurt my career, hurt my family, my friendships. It's put me in a big target on me that didn't need to be there. But I can't help but think of what the scripture says, where it says that he that knows the good that he ought to do and does not do it, that is sin for him. It's not enough for us to not do evil. We also have to do good. We're compelled by, at least for those of us that are Christians, we're compelled by a greater law than the golden mean. We're given the golden rule, which doesn't say don't do evil, don't do what you don't want others doing to you. That's the golden mean. The golden rule is do unto others what you want done unto you. And that means that when we see something that is wrong, we have to do something about it. And maybe all that we can do is report it or be a whistleblower, or in your case, fight it. Because that's the thing. You're not just fighting for you. You're fighting for everybody else that doesn't, that this is happening to. I've seen it over and over again where they just run people through the courts until they're financially broke and they can no longer, defend themselves. And that's why I got a real problem with the way that our police system is done. It's like they get people to take pleas on the threat that they're going to, we saw this with J6 all the time, where you had these guys that were telling them, we're going to put you away for 25, 30 years for basically trespassing, unless you cop to a plea deal. And this is what they did. And now these people have a permanent record for something that they didn't commit a crime.
Right.
So it is crazy. So I applaud you for continuing in this fight and not giving up. I know that, like you said, you're at retirement age. You don't need this headache. But at the end of the day, you're not doing this for you. You're doing it for every other American that comes after you that is going to have to face this sort of thing. And until we see justice.
Yeah, we got, and if people want to know more about it, there was a documentary made about my story. It's called The Eastman Dilemma. And it's still available for free streaming at eastmandilemma.com. It's about an hour long, and I encourage people to watch it. Get a group of their neighbors or at their church and watch it. In fact, I'll make this offer to anybody in your audience, and they can contact you, and you can refer them to me. If they get a group of people together, local Republican club, a local conservative club, whatever it is, big enough to make it worth my time, but show the movie, and then I will do a Zoom call with them and take Q&A after it.
I think that's a great idea. And John, I'm going to take you up on that.
All right. All right.
I know some good groups of people that I think that would be inspired by your story. John, I always like to we've talked about a lot of stuff, and I always like to end my conversations with folks in two ways. Number one, what is the most important thing that you want people to take away from our conversation tonight?
I think I want people to come away realizing we were on the precipice of losing everything our founders created and handed down to us. But for people like me and you and some others, we would have lost this country. It's now time to circle around and help the people that are standing on the front lines make sure that we win this fight. That's, I think, the most important thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And John, I'm sure you'll agree with me on this, that we have our fight to fight, and we got the things that we have to do in this. Was that faith without works is dead. But at the same time, we also have to recognize that this is a spiritual battle just as much as it is a physical one. And we need some help from on high. We need help, from our Creator. And he has the ability to influence things. There's a lot of things that are out of our control. And so I always like to close in prayer, it's because that's ultimately where my hope is. I hope, I still have hope in our country, but ultimately, if that fails me, the one area I know will never fail me is God. So I'm going to go ahead and close this in prayer. Heavenly Father, I just thank you for Dr. John Eastman and for the work that he has been dealing with. Lord, I thank you for, number one, holding him up through all of this storm. And I thank you for his tenacity and for what I call the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego attitude of not being willing to give in or give up no matter what, even if they throw him into the fire. Lord, just like you did with them, though, you protected them and you saved them. And because of it, you were brought to greater glory. And Lord, I pray that you would do the same with Mr. Eastman, Lord, that you would please help him to win these fights and that you would be glorified through it, that you would protect him and his family, his children, his loved ones, all of those who have even those that maybe have been connected with him or surrounded by him that have come under attack themselves. I pray that you would send your heavenly angels to wage war in the spiritual, to protect those that are around him, his family, his loved ones, his colleagues, and that ultimately he would come out of this victorious by your hand, Lord. And God, I pray for our nation. I pray, God, that you would restore justice in our land, Lord, in our nation, that at the highest levels, those that are corrupt would be removed and those that are righteous would be upheld. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Nate, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Folks, you heard it here. It's not just up to Dr. Eastman. It's not just up to people like myself. It's up to all of us to do our part. We all have a role and a responsibility to play in this. I want to thank everybody who watched tonight. We have about 2,500 people online watching right now. Thank you all for being a part of this conversation. And please pray for Dr. Eastman. Please donate and give if you can. And please don't give up on your country. It's up to us to hand over this country, this great nation that has been handed to us, to hand it over to the next generation in a better place than it was when it was given to us. And with that, have an awesome night, and remember to keep on fighting.
Thank you.
Raise some Cain. You gotta raise some Cain. In the heartland where the faith runs strong, we've seen the shadows growing long. Watch those around us be deceived. Yeah, the fight is at our doors, no matter who we believe. Corruption, lawless day and night, we'll speak the truth into the light. We'll bring the battle, heed the call, watch the whole thing fall. We gotta raise some Cain, show the lies, break some chains and make things right. Feel the power, be the change, time is now. We gotta raise some Cain.